Domestic violence is absolutely a real problem. There are many, many women around that are in horrendous situations. Women, and sometimes men, that are in situations where they're being abused and beaten horribly on a regular basis. People that feel like they cannot get out, they have no way to get out. That is not this defendant, and it never was. Now, some of those women who are victims of horrible domestic violence may be justified in a situation where they have to use self-defense to kill their abuser. Absolutely, there can be situations where that might be a valid point, but not for this defendant. This defendant used domestic violence and allegations of it to make progress on her goal. And her goal was she wanted sole custody of that child at all costs. And to understand that, I think we need to go through the background, even though this case really is about what happened in that house. What happened in that house, the last moments of Doug Benefield's life. But we need to go through the timeline to see the tenor of this relationship and to see how it unfolded. The bottom line is you have to decide at the moment that she pulled the trigger in that bedroom, was it reasonable and was it necessary? That self-defense instruction, it's called justifiable use of deadly force, is very complicated. But there are two words that are very, very important: reasonable and necessary. And those are the words that you have to evaluate everything this defendant did. So let's go through the timeline. In September 7th of 2016, this couple was married. After knowing each other 13 days and a 30-year age difference, they married each other. According to the defendant's testimony, very shortly after, there starts controlling behaviors and name-calling. Then, 4/15 of 2017, Doug Benefield has a vasectomy reversal. They decided, in less than a year of marriage, they wanted to have a child. This is about the time where the defendant says that there are these angry outbursts in South Carolina by Doug Benefield. And the state is not trying to say to you that Doug Benefield was an angel. The state is not trying to say that his behavior in South Carolina was appropriate. Not at all. His behavior was unacceptable at the time. But he also apologized for it. If you look at the the text messages between him and Ashley, he says, "I'll spend the rest of my life making this up." And he says how wrong he was and how stressed out he was. And he apologizes. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what happens after that. Does any more abuse happen after that? Within days of these anger outbursts in South Carolina, there's a lavish wedding reception where everyone seems to be happy. And then within about 3 months after that, the defendant gets pregnant. In the midst of all of this, she gets pregnant. The very next month, she moves to her mother's house in Florida because she's so sick and needs someone to take care of her. That is the last moment that this defendant ever lived in the same house with Doug Benefield. It was August of 2017. Very, very important date. Within a couple of months after getting to Florida, the defendant starts this campaign of complaints against Doug Benefield, all with the idea to get sole custody of her child that she was pregnant with. So she filed for a South Carolina injunction while she's in Florida. She doesn't even live in South Carolina. She doesn't even live with the person that she's trying to get an injunction against, but finds it appropriate to get an injunction in South Carolina. It is a mutual injunction. Don't mistake that. The judge did not make any findings of fault. There was no evidence presented. No one was ever found at fault. The two parties, Doug and Ashley Benefield, agreed, fine, we just won't contact each other. That is not what we are used to probably in Florida for injunctions. Then December 2017, so that's within a month, Ashley starts the series of allegations in Florida. So she files for this injunction in South Carolina. They mutually agree, okay, we're not going to talk to each other, we're not going to be around each other. But she starts a series of complaints in Florida. She starts saying he violated the South Carolina injunction, and she claims he's poisoning me. He's poisoning me and my unborn child, and also goes back to things that he supposedly did in South Carolina when they don't even live together. So on March of 2018, she gives birth. She gives birth after Doug Benefield has a lawyer contact her, because they're not really supposed to be talking to each other. The lawyer helps him write a letter where he says, I want to be a part of this child's birth. Please, I'll honor your wishes, but please let me be a part of this child's birth. Not only does she not respond, when she goes early to give birth, she doesn't tell Doug. She doesn't tell him once the baby's born. For weeks, he didn't know this child was born. Then she does not put his name on the birth certificate. Now, alleged behavior or not, she knows who the father is. Why is she not putting the father on the birth certificate? And then she gives this child her maiden name instead of her father's maiden name. Or, I'm sorry, her father's last name. Then 1 month later, she starts complaints to law enforcement. She says he violated the injunction in South Carolina. She files for a new injunction in Florida based on all of the same things in South Carolina. This is all based on the same information that she had already spoken about in South Carolina. And when she went to law enforcement trying to get them to file criminal charges against him for violation of an injunction, law enforcement was not on her side. And you heard from Detective Gillum about the conversations that they had. And the conversations that she had with Detective Gillum are the entire crux of this case. It is her motive, it is her plan, it is what she did everything for. He said her true motives were to use the criminal system to affect her family court case, to get sole custody of her child, which is what she wanted from the very beginning. He said it was very clear that she was trying to use the criminal system in that way, and he was very uncomfortable with that. He had forwarded charges to the state attorney's office, let the state attorney's office decide, which they end up not filing, by the way. And she did not think that was good enough. She was furious. She said, and I quote, "If the judge sees him arrested, it will help me keep my baby." She wanted him arrested in family court in front of the judge and made that very, very clear. That was what was important to her. The detective said in 20 whatever years that he's been doing this job, he has never had anybody ask him to do that. Never. And she was very adamant, and they talked for 15 to 20 minutes. And she went from crying almost hysterically to aggressive and yelling at him and then screeching at the top of her lungs, all because she could not get him to go with her plan. She also said to him, "You will fucking arrest him in front of the judge, and I will make sure that you do." Then she said, "I will do anything I have to do to keep my baby, asshole." She wasn't saying, "I'm so afraid of this man. Please help me. I'm a victim of domestic violence. I need help." Not at all. She's saying, "I want to keep my baby." And she's afraid that this man, who is 30 years older than she is, and a lot more established, has a lot more money, has a lot more resources, she's afraid that this man is going to get custody of her child instead of her. So after this discussion with Detective Gillum, in about September 17th of 2018, the second hearing for the injunction happens. Remember, this injunction hearing was in two parts. One was in July and one was in September. All of the same allegations. He's poisoning me, the stuff in South Carolina. Again, they're not even living together. And she fails. The judge in that case says, no injunction. And this man will have immediate visitation with his child, who, by the way, was 6 months old and he'd never met her. It wasn't for lack of trying. There may be a lot of deadbeat dads out there that don't care about seeing their children and don't want to be around. This man tried everything to be around for his child, to be there for the birth, to visit the child, to see the child, and she kept the child away from him for 6 months. And the first visitation, you heard from Stephanie Murphy, the first visitation All of a sudden, everything's glorious again. Now, all of a sudden, the defendant wants to go with him. I'll go with you. And now we're in a stage where we're acting like we're going to get back together. Because she knew the court system was not working, and she was afraid that if she didn't buddy up to him, he was going to get this child away from her. So it begins the charade of her telling him, we're going to get back together, we're going to be a family. She played on Doug Benefield's wishes. He wanted more than anything to have a family, his family together, to have his wife that he loved and this child all together. And she kept telling him, yes, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to work towards. So that starts about a year of them kind of getting along, right? And then September of 2019, which is about a year later, Doug finds out she's dating someone else. He files for divorce. And a series of complaints start against Doug Benefield for now abusing the child, which, by the way, were investigated by law enforcement, and not one of them resulted in any charges. And May 1st of 2020, the defendant, having failed in the criminal system, again, files for another injunction based on these allegations that fail in the criminal system. Do you see a pattern here? May 4th, only a few days later, after she files for another injunction, Doug files for sole custody of the child. This is Ashley Benefield's biggest fear, that this man is going to get sole custody. But she's making all of these grand allegations against him that he knows are not true. There's got to be something wrong, and it's probably not safe for this child to even be with her. So he files for full custody. And what happens? All of a sudden, she sidles up to him, and now we're getting back together. And we start to go to marriage counseling, and we go see Dr. Forrest, who referred them to Dr. Quintel. And they're going to marriage counseling about how they're going to get together. And to Doug, she's saying, yes, I want to reconcile. Let's get back together. But behind his back to the doctor, she's like, no way, no how. I'm not getting together with him. Then she goes on all these social outings with Doug and the child. Goes to the beach, goes to the movies, goes out to dinner, to lunch, swims at the pool at his apartment complex. Giving Doug all of these mixed signals. We're gonna reconcile. We're gonna get all this back together. And in the back of her mind, she knew all along. She was just waiting for an opportunity to strike. And then 6/1 of 2020, the system sends them for an evaluation with Dr. Broder. And they're like, what is going on here? Someone needs an evaluation. So they go to this evaluation with Dr. Broder, and this deception on the part of Ashley Benefield continues. She does the same thing. We're going to reconcile, we're going to get back together, and then when she's not with him, she's saying that that's not true. And then towards the end of September 2020, but before the 21st, there is a last meeting between Ashley Benefield and Dr. Broder. He said it was in his office. She was leaving. She was walking through the waiting room and going to the door, and she's upset because this is not going fast enough. I want the report. I want this to be done. We need to move to Maryland. Why do you think she's moving to Maryland? We need to move to Maryland. This is taking way too much time. And she says to him, I'll take matters into my own hands. And that was 7 days, up to 17 days before, depending on about what time it was, he gets murdered. On 9/21 of 2020, after this comment to Dr. Broder, she goes to mediation with Doug Benefield, and they end the mediation saying, everyone's going to drop everything. Because at this point, Doug had filed for a divorce, again, and Ashley had filed for an injunction, again. So at this hearing on the 30th, those things were going to be heard, as well as a joint motion to release a report by Dr. Broder. But they go to mediation, and at the end of mediation, it's very fast, because they all agreed, we're dropping everything. We're going to Maryland. So that was the plan. Ashley Benefield had no intention of dropping that injunction. Look at the text messages between her and Doug that were introduced by the state for the week before this homicide, murder happened. They're talking to each other about the fact that everything's going to be dropped. Give this attorney a call. Okay, I'll give that attorney a call. Ashley's telling him we're going to drop everything. And she knew that was not true. Her attorney testified, we were not dropping that injunction. We were ready to call witnesses. At that hearing on the 30th, we were going forward. Ashley Benefield knew that day it was over. It was going to be over. Her entire charade was going to be done. This entire get along, go along that she's trying to say was because of domestic violence. She was just trying to fake Doug out. And she knew that on the 30th, her ruse was up. Because if she goes forward with an injunction, what better way to tell someone you're not going to reconcile than trying to get another injunction? So what does this timeline tell us for what happened at the time of the shooting? Okay? It's background, yes, but also it tells you they did not live together for 3 years before the homicide. And if there was violence towards Ashley Benefield in South Carolina, that was 3 years before. And they hadn't lived together since. And is that something that justified her being in such fear of Doug Benefield that it was necessary to shoot and kill him? The answer is no. I do want to talk a little bit about domestic violence, and Mr. Ferris testified a lot about this wheel, this power and control wheel. So I want to put it up there. First of all, the overarching umbrella right here is physical and sexual violence. There is no physical violence in this case. There is no sexual violence. There's no allegations of any of this, unless you believe the defendant that the day this happened. But there was never any allegations of physical or sexual abuse. However, it's a power and control wheel. So let's go over some of these things. One of the first categories, using intimidation. So this is, did Doug Benefield use intimidation to control Ashley Benefield? They hadn't been together in 3 years. The first year they were apart, they barely even saw each other or spoke. So how exactly was he using intimidation to control her? And there's no allegations of threats during this time. The defendant testified she didn't say that there was anything going on during this time. One of the other prongs is using emotional abuse. Same answer. They weren't together. There was no allegation of emotional abuse. The defendant didn't talk about anything that was going on during this 3-year period, that he was emotionally abusing her. She felt comfortable enough. She even said, I told him when he thought he was going to move in with me, I told him I didn't want to do that. She felt comfortable enough to say, no, you're not moving in with me. But yet somehow he's emotionally abusing her. Then using isolation. How can that even apply when they're not even together? He has no influence over her comings and goings, over her daily routine, and she even started a new relationship with someone else. So how is it that Doug Benefield is exercising control over her by using isolation? And then minimizing, denying, and blaming. Well, nothing had happened in 3 years. So was there even anything to minimize, deny, or blame? Nothing had happened. And there was no evidence of anything happening, other than maybe some things that the defendant said happened, but did they really? For instance, Doug Benefield's peeking into my windows. My neighbor told me that Doug Benefield was peeking in my window. Okay, let's think about this. She said it was her across the street neighbor. Okay? So these houses face each other. Their backyards are behind the houses. The neighbor said, I saw somebody walking in my backyard that had a ball cap on. It was dark. I couldn't see what he looked like. And when I asked him what was going on, why was he there, he said he lived there. Somehow, this translates to this person is looking into your windows across the street, and the neighbor couldn't identify who it was. And here comes Ashley with her recording. Here, let me play this. Did you recognize his voice? Does that sound like him? Okay, it was Doug. Doug was peeking in my window. Really. Then the next spoke on the wheel is using children. This man did nothing but try to see his child over and over and over. Ashley Benefield kept his child from him. So if anybody was using power and control, it was Ashley Benefield against him. And I think if you look at a lot of these spokes, you're going to see a lot of behaviors on the part of the defendant that were actually using power and control instead of being a victim of power and control. Then male privilege is the next spoke. There was absolutely no evidence of male privilege. There was an email to the Realtor to get a house, just as one example. And if you read that email, he says, okay, but I have to check with Ashley first. How is that male privilege? He's telling this guy he's going to talk to his wife. Using economic abuse. Again, they didn't live together. Ashley Benefield's financially independent. She has her own home. She's completely separate, has her own car. That doesn't apply. Using coercion or threats. No threats. She didn't say there were any in those 3 years. None. There were no allegations that he threatened her or hit her or did anything. He didn't make any reports or threaten to report her to Department of Children and Families. He didn't say, oh, you better do what I say or I'm going to call DCF and tell them you're a bad mom. No. That was the other way around. That's what she was doing to him. There were no allegations that he was trying to get her to drop charges. Quite to the contrary. She was not dropping any charges of anything. And Mr. Ferris talked at the end of his testimony about domestic victim mentality. So let's talk about this. One of the things in the domestic victim mentality is covering for the abuser. Like making excuses, covering for them. Did you ever hear any evidence of the defendant doing that? Never. Making excuses for the abuser, making excuses for their behavior. Not once. She was telling everybody, anybody that would listen. Not reporting abuse, same answer. She was telling anyone that would listen and a bunch of people that wouldn't listen. Dropping criminal charges, that certainly didn't happen. The domestic victim mentality, she won't stand up for herself. Never saw that with this defendant. And she won't leave the relationship or the home. She left. She left the home, she left the relationship. They were not together for 3 years. So how does this domestic violence mentality, domestic victim mentality even apply to her? It doesn't apply to her. And don't be mistaken about what applies to her and what does not. Even, like I said before, even if you think that Doug Benefield's behavior was inexcusable and abusive in South Carolina, you have to remember that we are talking about 3 years later, after all of this time has gone by, and there are no allegations of anything else in between. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the jury instructions that the judge talked to you about. I just have a few on here that I want to go through. It's got to be overwhelming, I know, when you read the packet. There's a lot of words. So I try to help break it down a little bit. So the defendant is charged with murder in the second degree. So I would recommend the way you go through this is check off the things that you don't have to argue about. If everyone agrees to one of these, just check it off. So number one, Doug Benefield is dead. That should be easy. Check it off. There's no dispute. Number two, the death was caused by a criminal act of Ashley Benefield. Check it off. She shot him. Number three, there was an unlawful killing of Doug Benefield by an act eminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. Now that's a lot of words. So what does that mean? Next slide explains what that means. An act eminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind if it is an act or series of acts that, and again, check off things, okay? So a person of ordinary judgment would know is reasonably certain to kill or do serious bodily injury to another. Shooting a gun, firing a gun into someone clearly qualifies. A person of ordinary judgment would know that that would kill someone. Check. Let's go to number three. That this act is of such a nature that the act itself indicates an indifference to human life. Pulling a trigger, pointing a .45 caliber firearm at someone and pulling the trigger 4 times shows an indifference to human life. So then we go back to number 2. If the acts are done from ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. Now notice, this is or. It does not have to be all of those. Ill will is a pretty low threshold. What is ill will? Devising a plan to keep this man away from his child. Is that ill will? Sure. Filing complaints against him that are unfounded and nobody ever files. Fictitious complaints. That's ill will. Trying to do anything she can to keep this child to herself is ill will. Everything she did was for this goal, and everything she did was to get Doug Benefield out of the way. And unfortunately, the way she did that was by killing him to get him out of the way. That is ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. Now, the judge read to you that there's something called a lesser included offense. And what you may have heard, but it's in your packet, is the way you should handle a lesser included offense is such. So if you agree as a jury that the state has proven a charge beyond a reasonable doubt, you should start with the highest charge. So start with second-degree murder, and if all of the jurors agree unanimously that it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the state has proven their case and the defendant is not entitled to self-defense, then you don't even get to manslaughter. You don't have to go and then review manslaughter. You stop at the highest charge. You only get to manslaughter if you don't agree on the top charge. Then you get to the description of manslaughter. And again, check off the things that you are not arguing about. Doug Benefield is dead, check. Ashley Benefield intentionally committed an act or acts that caused the death of Doug Benefield. Yes, there's no question as to that. Now, the state did prove this, but the state also proved the added element of ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. So we have proven manslaughter, but we have also proven above manslaughter. And I want to show you the verdict form, and then we'll go back. This was the verdict form that the judge showed you, just to let you see it ahead of time. And this is the heading that the judge read. We, the jury, find as follows. As to the defendant, in this case, check only one. And here's A, B, and C that the judge talked to you about. Defendant is guilty of murder in the second degree as charged. Defendant is guilty of manslaughter, a lesser included offense, or defendant is not guilty. And then if you find A or B, then you have to answer all three of these questions. And then the foreperson will sign it and print their name. So the real question in this case is, was there self-defense? Was there justifiable self-defense? And the self-defense instruction is long, and you'll have it to review in the back. However, what you will notice are two words that come up all the time in that instruction. Self-defense, justifiable use of deadly force, would be Ashley Benefield was justified in using deadly force if she reasonably believed such force was necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm or a forcible felony. You're going to see those two words. And like I told you a little bit earlier, that's what you need to think of each time that you're trying to evaluate whether she used force appropriately. So let's get to the date of the offense, okay? Clearly, these two are getting along, at least according to Doug Benefield. He thought they were getting along. If you look at the text messages between the two of them, if you go by the information that you had from the witness stand that Ashley was acting nice, she was acting like they were going to try and reconcile in Maryland. They were moving together. They were using the same truck. He was coming to her house to help her move heavy things. So they were getting along. They actually went to the mediation during this time. It was about 3 days before she killed him. They had mediation where they said they were going to drop everything, move into Maryland, everything's going to be fine. But obviously that was not Ashley Benefield's plan because she knew she wasn't going to drop the injunction. Obviously, the day of the offense, Doug Benefield had a right to be at the house. She invited him over. They had text messages back and forth. Trucker on the way, you know, he's taking a picture of the stuff in the back of his truck. And she'd let him in the gate numerous times before. So he had a right to be at the house. She clearly was not afraid, so she had him over. And then her mother clearly was not afraid for her because then as soon as he gets there, she goes to the park with the daughter. So nobody's afraid at this point for Ashley Benefield's safety. And there's only one person who knows what happened in that house that is still alive, and that's Ashley Benefield. And you heard her story, and she made herself a witness just like any other witness in this trial. And you will judge her credibility and the truth of what she said just like you do any other witness, and see if it matches the evidence in this case. If you notice, When being asked questions, she became evasive. If questions got a little too difficult or she didn't really have an answer for it, specifically on cross-examination, she would use methods to avoid answering the question. One of the methods that you saw over and over was, I don't know, I just don't know, I don't know. The other method was crying, started crying. Did you ever see one tear come out of her eyes? Did you ever see one drop of liquid, one red eye, one swollen eye? She had a breakdown. We had to take a break, crying hysterically. Takes the stand right after that. Eyes are just fine, makeup's just fine. That goes to her credibility. What is she trying to convey to you? The truth or her version of events? Let's look at what she did say. She said, during this move that Doug bumps her on the shoulder a couple times, body check or something. She didn't really act that out very well. Who knows what that was. Doug, carrying a box, rammed a box into her stomach and scratched her. But did you see those pictures? Does that scratch look like a scratch from a cardboard box? Wouldn't you expect a bruise to be there as well? You'll have the pictures in the back. So look at those pictures and see, there's no bruising. They look like cat scratches. The defendant also said when they were by the front door of the house that he grabbed her by the wrist and hit her in the head. So when I asked her, okay, what do you mean hit? Well, I don't know. Okay, was it an open hand? Was it a closed hand? What was it? I don't know. She should know if a grown man balled up his fist and punched her in the side of the head. And there would be a lot more damage than what she claimed she had. But she didn't know. He just hit her. Now, 4 people testified that they saw her after this incident, very shortly after this incident. Well, one of them was 3 days later, but the rest of them were very shortly after this incident. John Sands, the neighbor, he didn't see any swelling. He didn't see any injuries. He didn't see any disheveled clothes like there'd been a rumble. Detective or Officer Burrell, Deputy Burrell, was the one that put her in the back of his squad car. No injuries. Didn't notice any injuries to her head or swelling to her face. Crime scene tech Dvorak took pictures. Didn't notice any injuries, any swelling to the face. 3 days later, crime scene tech Conlon takes pictures just to make sure, because bruises don't always come up right away, that she's not bruised. No bruises, no swelling, no nothing. But yet the defendant sits right here and tries to tell you that her eye was droopy and the side over here was swollen. Let's look at these pictures. These are 4 pictures that were entered into evidence. The first picture was, the defendant said, was before she even knew Doug Benefield. She thought it was before she even knew him. The second picture at the top, over on the right, is the night of the shooting. Down lower left is 3 days later, and then one over is about 6 weeks later. Does it really look like her face is swollen? She said the side. She said right here on the right side. Or, I'm sorry, the left side. Right here. The left side of her face doesn't, it actually looks slimmer than it did in the picture taken before she even knew Doug. So let's talk about what she did when she claims that Doug grabbed, I think she said she was going for the front door. He grabbed her arm. She kind of spun around. He hits her in the head, although she didn't know if it was open hand or not. And then she said, I just wanted to get away. I just wanted to get away. Right? Here's the front door. Right? She went this way and could have gone right out the door, but she just wanted to get away. She didn't go right out the door. She turned to her right and went into this room. This room that has nothing in it except for a mattress, a broom, and a hamper, and 2 handguns. It's hard to see in this picture because of the lighting, but I just want to remind everyone, here's the mattress, here's the broom, nothing else in this room, but there's a hamper right here with a gun on it. And there's a gun in this closet right here. And that's where she runs. And this is a better picture of the hamper and where the murder weapon was. So she just wants to get away, but she runs into the very back corner of this room and grabs a firearm. Now, she claims that as she's retrieving this firearm, he slams the door open and she turns around, right? And she sees him standing there. When I asked her to get down and show me what he was doing, that was another one of those evasive talk. I don't know, he was in a fighter stance. I don't know what fighters do, but I know it's a fighter stance. Okay, well, show me. What do you mean a fighter stance? I don't know, kind of like this. Okay, well, what are his hands doing? Just kind of moving around. Okay, so his hands are kind of moving around, and it didn't look a lot like a fighter stance. And then she said, I'm standing there with the gun pointed at him, and he lunges at me. He lunges at me. Let's think about this. So if she's standing in the room, she has the gun in her hand, and he just came in the door, and she's pointing the gun at him. She says he takes a fighting stance. First of all, he's right-handed. Do this yourselves when you get in the back. If someone told you to get in a fighting stance, what would you do? And determine for yourselves, use your common sense, which side would be bladed away. I think you'll find that your strong hand is going to be the one that's bladed away. So if he's right-handed, he's in a fighting stance, he's going to be like this. Interesting, because he's shot from this side. So he's like this, and then she says he lunges at me, right? So if he lunges at her, he's head on, straight on to her, lunging. That bullet hole would have been here and out here. Would have gone straight through him, front to back. That is not the way that bullet went. That bullet went side to side. And if he's in a fighting stance and he's right-handed, why would he have this side towards her? And Mr. Haig, the expert, the firearms expert, displayed when I said, okay, I'm going to point a gun at you. You show me where your body would have to be in order to get that trajectory. And he turned sideways. So his body in his fighting stance would have to be completely sideways. And what, he's skipping to her to lunge? I mean, how is that trajectory going to happen based on what she said? More than likely, the hands that were up was a defensive stance. He probably came into the room and said, whoa, she's got a gun, and started to turn around. He had his hands up, like, whoa, what are you doing? It makes no sense to be in a fighting stance. So I want to talk a little bit about this trajectory, just because there's sort of some misconception that this shot was front to back. That is just the planes with which the medical examiner uses. So it can be a little confusing. But if you look at the way this arrow is, the bullet goes in right by the right nipple and then lands right here. So it is side to side. Once it went in where the nipple is, did it curve a little bit to the back? Yes. That's why it's like in the back. That's why they say front to back. So it went side to side and a little bit to the back. There is no way he was facing her when she shot him. No way. Here's another angle. This is from the back. So if it went in on the side, the right-hand side, and that red dot is where it landed in the back. And let's talk about leg wound. It's very hard to determine exactly how this leg wound happened. And we may never know exactly how it happened. But this is the basic trajectory of it if a person were in a normal standard anatomic position. This is the medical examiners said that. This is a standard anatomical position. So in a standard anatomical position, that is the way the wound path went through his leg. So you can figure out for yourself different ways that might have happened. Now, Dr. Liu said, based on information that she got from Ashley Benefield, by the way, that it must have happened this way. That once he shot the first time, somehow he falls and his legs go way up in the air and he shot like this. Where did that bullet go if he was shot like that? The expert testified about the two that went into the wall had not gone through a body. He said the one that hit the leg was in the room. Might have been kicked, and that's normal when you have emergency technicians in there and they're kicking things around. But the projectile was in the room. It was not in the wall. So if he's falling back this way and his legs flipping way up, and by the way, Dr. Vega said the only way your legs flip up like that is if you're falling over a rail or, falling over something and your legs come up that high. So that just does not make sense with the rest of the evidence. Now, this may not be the way it happened, but it is also another way that it could have happened. He is turned away, leg up, And that bullet could have gone in and come out his knee, and his leg was bent. So you use your own judgment and decide what you think about that leg wound. What's important is this wound. This was the wound that killed him, and he was not facing her at the time. The defendant trying to say he was in a fighting stance, he lunged at me, that is just her, once again, trying to manipulate the system. She's trying to manipulate you to believe that this was necessary, he was coming at me, but the physical evidence does not bear that out. It does not show that he was coming at her and that she had to shoot him. And afterwards, she runs over to the neighbor's house. Not once do you hear her say, "An ambulance, I don't know if he's still alive. You know, I had to do it, but somebody help him." Not once. Not once did you ever hear any concern that I just shot another human being, regardless of what the facts are. No. And then she sees her mother come by the car. Not once does she say, "Mom, he just came at me. Like, I had to shoot him. It was awful." Nope. Not a word. She goes back to her mom that night. Not a word. Really? You're not going to tell your mom exactly what happened? And then this lady, Russell, Barbara Russell, that she lives with for 9 months after the shooting, never tells her what happened. Not once. Remember, the defendant sat right there and said the defendant never punched her, ever. Never choked her, never kicked her, never came at her with a knife, never came at her with a club, never came at her with a bat. And she was the only person armed in that room. Doug Benefield was not armed. He had no weapons. He was laying on the floor dying, and she goes to the neighbor and not once asks for an ambulance. And he dies. They're on the way to the hospital or in the hospital. She was the only one armed, and it was not necessary. She did not have to shoot him. It was not reasonable. She did not have to shoot him. She had an agenda, and it worked for what she wanted, and she got what she wanted. Because after she killed him, what did she get? Sole custody of the child. And that's murder. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Taylor, do you need the screen?